The interior of a Viking longship at sea offered no refuge from the elements. Water seeped through overlapping strakes with every flex of the hull. Wind cut across open decks where 30 or 40 men sat shoulder to shoulder on sea chests that doubled as rowing benches. There were no cabins, no partitions, no designated sleeping quarters. At night, men wrapped themselves in wool and leather and lay where they had rowed, bodies pressed together for warmth. During storms, seawater pooled in the bilge and sloshed against their legs. The air inside this confined space carried the smell of wet wool, salt-cured fish, human sweat, and the fermenting contents of leather sacks. By contemporary standards of infectious disease transmission, these vessels should have been floating incubators for epidemic illness. Modern epidemiological models predict catastrophic outcomes in such environments. When populations are confined in close quarters with poor ventilation, shared food supplies, and no waste management infrastructure, pathogens move efficiently from host to host. Respiratory droplets accumulate in still air. Gastrointestinal bacteria spread through contaminated surfaces and shared eating implements. The probability of outbreak increases with journey duration, and Viking expeditions could last weeks without landfall. Historical maritime disasters provide ample evidence of this pattern. British naval vessels in the 18th century lost more men to typhus and dysentery than to combat. Immigrant ships crossing the Atlantic in the 19th century became synonymous with cholera and typhoid. Even 20th century military transports saw disease spread rapidly through cramped troop quarters. The Viking longship, lacking even the rudimentary sanitation systems of later vessels, should have experienced similar or worse outcomes. Archaeological evidence, however, does not support this prediction. Excavations of Viking graves and settlement sites reveal skeletal markers of chronic nutritional stress and traumatic injury, but not the characteristic patterns associated with shipboard epidemic disease. Mass burial sites linked to maritime expeditions do not appear in the archaeological record with the frequency observed in later periods. Saga literature, though filtered through centuries of oral tradition and Christian manuscript production, describes deaths from violence, drowning, and exposure, but rarely attributes mass casualties to disease during sea voyages. This absence requires explanation. It cannot be dismissed as incomplete record-keeping, because later medieval sources document shipboard illness extensively. The silence suggests that Viking-age sailors experienced disease transmission differently than their successors. The longship itself provides the first clue. Unlike later vessels with enclosed gun decks and crew quarters below the waterline, the Viking ship was fundamentally open. Its shallow draft and clinker-built construction meant the hull was never fully sealed. Water entered continuously through the slight gaps between overlapping planks, through the seams sealed with tarred wool, and over the low freeboard during any significant wave action. This leakage was not a design flaw, but an accepted characteristic of the construction method. The hull flexed with wave motion, and that flexibility required looseness in the joints. Crew members bailed constantly, using wooden scoops to throw water back over the side. This process flushed the bilge repeatedly throughout each day. Any organic matter that accumulated in the lowest part of the hull, food scraps, vomit, blood from injuries, human waste was diluted and expelled within hours. The ship never developed the stagnant pools of contaminated water that characterized the holds of later vessels. The treatment of human waste followed a similarly immediate pattern. There were no latrines, no designated waste storage areas, no systems for collection and delayed disposal. Men urinated and defecated directly over the side of the ship while it was underway. Archaeological analysis of Viking ships has found no structural features designed for waste management, no troughs, no dedicated positions along the rail. The practice was evidently informal and immediate. This created no privacy, but it prevented accumulation. Waste entered seawater instantly and was dispersed by current and wave action. It never sat in containers, never contaminated shared surfaces, never provided breeding grounds for flies or other disease vectors. The biological material was diluted beyond infectious concentration within seconds. This stands in stark contrast to later ships, where waste accumulated in bilges or in barrels stored below deck, creating concentrated sources of pathogens that persisted for entire voyages. The sailing pattern reinforced this environmental reset. Viking longships were not blue-water vessels designed for extended ocean crossings. Their shallow draft and open construction made them unsuitable for prolonged periods away from land. Most Norse expeditions followed coastlines, crossing open water only when necessary and landing frequently. Every few days, often every night, when weather and terrain permitted, crews beached their ships. This was partly practical. The vessels were light enough to be hauled onto shore by their crews, but it had significant biological consequences. Each landing disrupted the confined shipboard environment. Men dispersed to gather firewood, hunt, forage, and relieve themselves away from the vessel. They washed in streams or the sea. They ate freshly cooked food rather than preserved rations. They slept on ground rather than pressed together in the hull. These intervals broke the chain of person-to-person transmission that drives shipboard epidemics. A pathogen might infect one or two individuals during a 3-day stretch at sea, but before it could spread through the entire crew, the environmental conditions changed. The temporary camp provided space, fresh air, and a behavioral shift that interrupted transmission dynamics. Cultural practices surrounding personal hygiene added another layer of protection. Arabic sources from the 10th century describe Norse traders along the Volga with a mixture of fascination and disgust, noting their daily washing rituals using shared basins. While the observer found the practice unsanitary by his standards, multiple men washing face and hair in the same water, the fact that washing occurred daily is significant. Archaeological evidence supports this attention to grooming. Combs are among the most common artifacts found in Viking Age contexts, appearing in graves, settlements, and urban excavations. They were personal items, often elaborately decorated, carried by individuals of all social classes. The removal of lice and other parasites was clearly a regular concern. This matters epidemiologically because ectoparasites serve as vectors for several serious diseases, including typhus. A culture that maintained head and body hair through frequent combing reduced its exposure to louse-borne illness, even in the absence of any understanding of disease transmission. The absence of stored fresh water eliminated another major source of shipboard contamination. Later, sailing vessels carried water in wooden casks, where it quickly became brackish and colonized by bacteria. The longer the voyage, the more dangerous the water supply became. Crews rationed intake and suffered accordingly. Viking ships carried no such stores. Instead, they transported fermented liquids, beer, mead, and soured milk products. The fermentation process produces alcohol and lactic acid, both of which inhibit bacterial growth. While these beverages provided hydration, they also delivered compounds that suppressed pathogen survival. The alcohol content was typically low, insufficient to cause significant intoxication during normal consumption, but high enough to prevent the liquid from becoming a disease reservoir. When fresh water was needed, crews obtained it at landing sites, consuming it immediately rather than storing it for future use. This eliminated the weeks-long incubation of waterborne bacteria that plagued later maritime ventures. The ship's cargo and provisions contributed inadvertently to this protective environment. Dried fish, cured meat, hard bread, and fermented dairy products dominated the shipboard diet. These foods were preserved through methods that reduced moisture content or altered pH, making them inhospitable to most bacteria. They required no cooking and generated minimal waste. The lack of fresh produce meant no rotting vegetable matter to attract flies or provide breeding sites for pathogens. The diet was nutritionally limited and would have caused deficiency diseases on longer voyages, but for journeys measured in weeks rather than months, it provided sufficient calories without creating biological hazards. Later ships, carrying more varied and perishable supplies, introduced more opportunities for food-borne illness. Temperature played a complex role. The North Atlantic environment was cold enough to slow bacterial replication but not so extreme as to create severe hypothermia risk during all seasons. Pathogens that thrive in tropical maritime environments, cholera, yellow fever, dengue, were not factors in northern waters. The cold reduced the survival time of bacteria and viruses on surfaces. Respiratory droplets in cold air behave differently than in warm, humid conditions, potentially altering transmission efficiency for some diseases. This climatic factor was not unique to Viking ships, but it formed part of the environmental context that shaped disease dynamics. The same vessels operating in warmer waters might have experienced different outcomes. The social structure of Viking expeditions introduced its own biological constraints. Crews were not random assemblages of strangers. Most expeditions drew men from connected kinship networks and local communities. They had often grown up in proximity, sharing exposure to common pathogens throughout childhood. This meant a baseline level of shared immunity. When disease did spread through such a group, it tended to affect all susceptible individuals quickly, rather than smoldering through successive waves as new, unexposed individuals were introduced. The rapid transmission that would seem dangerous in epidemiological terms actually shortened the overall period of risk. Once the susceptible fraction of the crew had been infected, the pathogen had nowhere else to go. In contrast, later ships with diverse crews drawn from distant populations brought together individuals with different immunological histories, allowing diseases to persist longer and affect larger proportions of the total population. The scale of each vessel also mattered. A longship carried between 30 and 60 men depending on size. This was sufficient for group survival, but small enough that behavioral norms could be enforced informally. There was no anonymity, no ability to hide unsanitary behavior without social consequences. If one man repeatedly contaminated shared spaces or exhibited obviously infectious symptoms, the entire group knew immediately and could respond. Larger ships with crews numbering in the hundreds could not maintain the same level of social regulation. Deviant behavior became easier to conceal, and by the time a disease outbreak was recognized, it had already spread beyond control. The intimacy of the small crew paradoxically provided a form of collective monitoring that limited risk. These factors did not operate independently. They formed an interlocking system where each element reinforced the others. The leaky hull encouraged frequent bailing, which prevented waste accumulation, which reduced disease vectors, which lowered the pressure on personal hygiene practices, which remained effective because crew size allowed social enforcement. Remove any single element, and the system's effectiveness would degrade. This was not a designed solution, but an emergent property of constraints: available materials, construction techniques, sailing capabilities, cultural norms, and environmental conditions all happened to align in a way that reduced epidemic risk. Later, maritime technology disrupted this balance. The development of deep-hulled, fully decked vessels in the late medieval period allowed for longer voyages and greater cargo capacity. But it created enclosed spaces below the waterline. These holds trapped air, moisture, waste, and eventually disease. The professionalization of naval crews meant larger groups of men drawn from broader geographical areas, weakening the protective effect of shared community immunity. The shift from frequent coastal landings to extended blue water crossings eliminated the environmental resets that had interrupted transmission chains. Advances in food preservation allowed longer voyages but introduced new contamination pathways. The transition from open, leaky, frequently beached longships to sophisticated sailing vessels represented technological progress by most measures, yet it correlated with dramatic increases in shipboard mortality from infectious disease. The Viking sailors possessed no germ theory, no understanding of infectious agents, no conscious strategy for disease prevention. They did not know that immediate waste disposal into moving seawater reduced bacterial load. They did not understand that frequent landings interrupted transmission chains. They were not aware that fermented beverages inhibited pathogen growth. They could not have articulated why their construction methods and sailing patterns reduced epidemic risk compared to later designs. Their practices emerged from practical constraints and cultural traditions, not from medical reasoning. The effectiveness of their system was accidental, a fortunate alignment of environment, habit, and technology that produced protective outcomes without intentional public health planning. This creates an uncomfortable implication for contemporary perspectives on technological advancement. The most sophisticated vessels of later centuries, products of accumulated engineering knowledge and substantial capital investment, proved more dangerous to their crews in biological terms than the simpler, more primitive craft they replaced. Progress in one domain range, capacity, durability, created vulnerabilities in another. The Viking longship succeeded in limiting disease transmission not because its builders were wiser, but because their constraints forced solutions that happened to work. The ship's limitations became its protections. When those limitations were overcome through technological development, the protections vanished as well, and crews suffered accordingly until new knowledge caught up centuries later. The historical record suggests that effective systems do not always emerge from understanding, and that advancement in complexity does not guarantee advancement in all relevant outcomes. Sometimes survival arises from necessity, from the narrow channels carved by what is possible rather than what is intended, from the intersection of circumstance and habit creating patterns that work for reasons no one present could explain.